I mentioned the North Korean troops that have landed in Russia. Now, as an aside, this is apropos of nothing, but imagine you're a North Korean soldier. You've been malnourished all your life. You're poorly trained, poorly equipped. You're living in North Korea under possibly the most oppressive regime in the world. And you're thinking to yourself, well, can't get any worse than this. Guess I've hit rock bottom. And suddenly you find yourself in Russia, about to be thrown into the meat grinder that is Putin's war. And you just got to think, what is the morale like? What are the command and control problems that the Russians are having with the North Koreans? Talk to me a little bit about that from just the what is the operational advantage other than just having more people to throw at the front lines as cannon fodder?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. Great question. So it's actually an open question for us that we're actively researching here at the Institute about North Korean force structure within the Russian armed forces. So the forces that the North Koreans sent, they come from the North Korean 11th Army Corps, which is North Korean Special Forces. The Army Corps has airborne brigades and Special Forces brigades, so they're light infantry, right? They're not coming with their tanks and heavy vehicles and stuff. And in fact, they were deployed from the Russian Far East in unmarked civilian vehicles to get to Kursk. So what we're probably looking at is you're going to have infantry, highly skilled, highly mobile infantry, but infantry nonetheless. Look, it's it's a known unknown. It's a big question mark for North Korean combat effectiveness because the North Koreans have not actually fought a proper war since the 1950s with the Korean War. They sent some advisors to Vietnam in the 70s, and they sent some advisors for the Yom Kippur War to Egypt in 1975, but that was 49 years ago. So it's really an unknown. It's a really an unknown factor. But I will say the following: the North Koreans, coming from the special forces, they're disciplined. They will have, I think, pretty strong cohesion within their own units, and it seems that they are likely going to be deployed as singular units as opposed to replacements. If they were sent as replacements into Russian units, that would cause a lot of interoperability problems, and that would not be very intelligent. I would hope the Russians would make that mistake, but it seems the North Koreans are going to be given and deployed as full units. That's interesting. That will create command seams between where the area responsibility for a Russian and a North Korean unit on the front line begins and ends. And if you're the Ukrainians, you can think creatively about how are you going to conduct raids or counterattacks into that command seam. The other thing that I'll add is that beyond the operational picture, which is sort of a question mark, it could be a massive strategic benefit for the Kremlin. I don't think that the North Koreans are in the business of sending just 10,000 troops here or there. Bloomberg reported that there's a second batch of 10,000 North Koreans that are in the breach getting ready to be deployed as well. Like I said earlier, the Russians lose and generate about 30,000 men per month. The current system for Russian force generation, however, is cracking. It's increasingly delinquent. And if the North Koreans can, for example, provide 15,000 guys per month, that would wipe off the slate one half of Russia's casualty count. And that would drastically increase Putin's ability to strategically resource this war in the long run. So it's actually quite a major development in the strategic sense.
Well, I mean, I suppose if you look at the history of it all, obviously there's been a precedent in the past. North Korean pilots flew in Vietnam, and Russian pilots were there. They've had this cultural exchange, if you will, in years past. But is it more of an effort on Putin's part? Because you think about these things in terms of who's gaining what from this, right? I mean, any transaction like this, right? Any support that Iran, for instance, provides to Russia, what are they getting out of it? And so with the North Koreans, you have to assume, all right, they're getting paid for sending thousands of troops up to Russia. They're getting combat experience for their troops, assuming that some of them survive. And I would assume they're getting weapons technology transfer from the Russians. But on the Russian side, to what degree is this an effort for Putin not to conscript or to raise another conscription with his own population and to avoid what he knows would be a very unpopular move?
Yeah. The Russian force generation project is really in a bad spot, and I'm confident that Putin will be faced with a big decision point probably in the next 18 months about whether or not he has to call another wave of mobilization like he did in fall 2022. Look, the Russian governors, the regional provinces are starting to write letters to the Ministry of Defense requesting that they officially lower the monthly quotas for the guys that they have to send because it's just not working. The Russian Ministry of Defense is now offering a $2 million $2 million ruble signing bonus to Russians that join the Russian military. The average annual salary for a Russian is 1.2 million rubles. I think what Putin wants to do is ensure that, he really wants to not have to call on St. Petersburg and Moscow and those privileged Western Russians that have more political power and representation in the Kremlin system of governance to not create the regime instability. And so he'd rather go to the Russian Far East and create an alternative pipeline where he can get 15,000 North Koreans a month in order to stave off the inevitable of him having to make really hard decisions. And I think a personal thing that's really important for Putin is that he has to own mobilization. Most of the problems with the Russian military, he can scapegoat onto the Ministry of Defense, the Chief of the General Staff, various different generals, but Putin cannot scapegoat the decision to call another round of mobilization. That is a decision that the Russian president and the president alone undertakes, and he knows that.